The Fantastic Farm and Garden Calculator is a tool for gardeners and farmers to quickly and easily calculate how much they can grow on the amount of land that they have, how much to plant, and when to plant it in order to feed a specific number of people a specific quantity of produce over an entire growing season, or simply to sell in the retail or wholesale markets. This video will provide basic information about filling in and using the calculator. So let's go ahead and get started. Well, here we are at the logged in screen for the Fantastic Farm and Garden Calculator. Down the right side is a list of options. Log out for when you're finished working on the calculator. Calculator instructions, which is probably the most important option on this page. I strongly recommend that you read the instructions before trying to fill out the calculator. There is a lot of really important information for properly filling out the calculator in the instructions, and if you don't read them, the values generated by the calculator may be incorrect. Now I recommend opening these in a new tab and printing them out. That way you don't have to go back and forth between two tabs as you fill out the calculator. These options are templates that we will return to once we have a calculator that's filled in. Here is the option for opening a new calculator form. And here is where previously saved versions are located. You can open these or delete them, or you can copy and resave them under a new name in order to make changes to previous versions. Well, let's go ahead and create a new calculator. I'm going to open this in a new tab. And here we are in the calculator form page. And first we're going to name it. Let's call this Demo. And we'll save it. You'll know that your version is saved because you will be returned to the logged in page where it indicates that your calculator has been saved. Now we'll scroll down and reopen Demo so that we can continue to work on it. Next, let's put in some basic information. We'll start by inputting the number of people that we're trying to feed. Let's say we're going to feed 10 people. Next, we'll put in the total number of rows we have. We'll put in 10 rows. Next, we'll input our row width. Since we have 36-inch wide raised beds, we'll put in 36 inches. And we'll put in our frost date, which in our area is May 18th. Next, we'll put in our garden end date. The garden end date is the date when you will harvest all remaining crops and prepare your garden space for winter. We're going to put in September 30th. This orange section is where the calculator tracks how much space we have used. We'll return to it as we fill out the calculator to make sure we have not planned for more space than we have. Now we are going to fill out our row lengths. So we'll scroll down to the row length input section. If we have more than 45 rows, we can just fill in our total row length. Let's say it's 300 feet. Or we can fill in rows of the same length or of varying lengths. Now, let's update the calculator. As you can see, the orange section now shows that we have a total of 135 feet of planting space. You can save your work at any time. I suggest saving often so that you don't risk losing any of your work. So, we'll click on the Save My Calculator tab. Now we'll scroll down and reopen Demo again so that we can continue to work on it. Next, let's fill in information for our cold weather crops. We'll scroll down to the cold weather crop input section of the calculator. First, we'll fill in how many pounds per week of each crop we want to feed each of our 10 people. These cannot be fractions but must be decimals. In this case, we're going to fill in 1/2 pound of beets per person per week. If we're using the farm version of the calculator, we'll fill in how many pounds per week of each crop we want to sell. Let's say we want to sell 10 pounds of beets per week. The fields headed in orange are for cold weather crops grown during the early part of the season, before the hottest part of the summer, when these crops do not do well. We'll fill in the total number of weeks we want to harvest each of these crops in the early part of the season. For our beets, let's say we are going to harvest them for 3 weeks in the early part of the season. And we'll fill in the interval for which we want to harvest these crops, either 7 days for weekly or 14 days for biweekly. These are the only two options for this field. Let's say that we are going to harvest our beets biweekly in the early part of the season. The fields headed in yellow are for cold weather crops grown during the later part of the season after the hottest part of the summer, when these crops do not do well. We'll fill in the total number of weeks we want to harvest each of these crops in the later part of the season. For our beets, let's say we are going to harvest them for 2 weeks. And we'll fill in the interval for which we want to harvest these crops, either 7 days for weekly or 14 days for biweekly. Let's say that we are going to harvest our beets weekly in the later part of the season. For crops grown later in the season, we also fill in our second planting date. This date is dependent on when the soil in your area is cool enough for seeds to germinate. Many seed companies will specify when cold weather crops can be sown for harvest in the later part of the season. Let's say that it is safe for us to plant our later season beets in the middle of July. Finally, we'll fill in the average maturation time for each of our cold weather crops. This can be found on the back of seed packets. For our beets, let's say that it takes them 60 days to mature. Now, not all cold weather crops behave the same way. Garlic, onions, and shallots are not succession planted, and thus nothing will be filled in the fields headed in yellow for planting for a later season harvest. So for garlic, we'll just fill in how many pounds per week we want to feed each of our 10 people. Let's say 1/4 pound per week. And if we are using the farm version of the calculator, how many pounds per week we want to sell. Let's say 3 pounds. Now we'll fill in the total number of weeks that we want to harvest garlic. Let's say 5 weeks. Garlic is a slow-growing crop, so we'll fill in 230 days for the maturation time. Now let's update the calculator to see how much space we've used. Well, it looks like we've used 43 row feet in planting garlic and beets, and we have 92 row feet left. You can save your work at any time. So we'll click on Save My Calculator. And we'll scroll down and reopen Demo so that we can continue to work on it. Now let's fill in information for our hot weather crops. We'll scroll down to the hot weather crop input section of the calculator. As with the cold weather crops, we'll fill in how many pounds per week of each hot weather crop we want to feed our 10 people. Let's start with beans. Let's say we are going to feed each of our 10 people 1/2 pound of beans per week. If we're using the farm version of the calculator, we'll also fill in how many pounds per week we want to sell. Let's say 5 pounds per week. Hot weather crops generally, just like the garlic, onions, and shallots, are not succession planted, but beans do not behave like other hot weather crops. They will need to be succession planted so that not all of your beans ripen at once. We suggest planting them every 2 or 3 weeks. I'll talk more about this later. Next, we'll fill in our maturation time for each of our hot weather crops. For beans, we're going to fill in 70 days. Let's go ahead and update the calculator so we can see how much space we've used. Uh-oh, it looks like we've used more space than we have. We'll need to scroll down and make some changes. Let's change the number of pounds of beets that we had planned to sell from 10 pounds to 3 pounds per week. And let's change the number of pounds of beans we had planned to sell from 5 pounds to 3 pounds per week. Now we'll scroll back up, Click on the Update Calculations tab and see what happens. That's better. We still have 5 feet of unused space. Let's go ahead and save the calculator. And we'll scroll down and reopen Demo again so that we can continue to work on it.